Mhm.
Right.
Right. 2 weeks. All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started with our lecture for today. So a little bit of info on our speaker. Well, first of all, I'm Dr. Starklis, you know that. I'm giving the introductions, but for those of you who don't, I'm an associate teaching professor of history. And I'm also the undergraduate faculty mentor. So I have invited, on behalf of the department, Dr. Nikolas Hoel here today. He is a medievalist that I know from our days in Wisconsin, so University of Wisconsin. Dr. Hoel is now currently an instructor of history at Northeastern Illinois University in Chicago, where he's also president of the Faculty Senate. I know for some of you that has no specific meaning whatsoever, but it's a big job that he is now tackling. He's trained as both an early medievalist and advancedist, and a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he earned his PhD. He teaches all things ancient and medieval at his institution, which is what ancient and medieval scholars tend to do at most schools of the size of BGSU or the Northern Illinois University. His research interests include and focus on the religious and intellectual history of Latin antiquity, in particular hagiography. You'll probably learn a little bit more about that today. If you don't know what that term means yet. Monasticism and papal history. His current book project looks at Gregory the Great's thoughts concerning monasticism, and he is also interested in the tensions of sanctity, disability, and power, which is the inspiration for his talk today, where he'll be presenting on the strange case of the Graptoi, disability, religion, and power in Byzantium. This lecture is presented by the Department of History with support from the Department of World Languages and Cultures, the AYA Social Studies program, and the Philosophy Department. So without further ado, I will let Dr. Hoel speak.
All right. We have sound in the back? Okay. Thank you so much for the kind and welcoming introduction. Thank you all for being here today. It has truly been a pleasure to be on your campus today, and I look forward to continuing my relationship with your department by teaching a graduate class on medieval history this summer. That said, there's business to attend to now. I always tell my students that for the semester they are in my class, they get to be historians, even if for that short amount of time. Similarly, for this talk, if you are not one, you all get to be historians and scholars for the next hour or so. So I welcome you to come along with me on this intellectual journey full of sanctity, brutality, and theory, as well as sound and fury, hopefully signifying something. So, what? There it is. Within the first few minutes of The Sound of Music, there's another superior of the convent asks, how do you solve a problem like Maria? The question prompts a musical number that features a number of nuns repeating the question that drives the plot of the entire movie and song. The answer, for those of you who may not have seen the movie or haven't in a long time, is that you send the nun in question off to be the nanny for 7 children whose mother recently died and whose father is in the Austrian army on the brink of World War II and is faced with the prospect of serving Hitler, even though he is aware that his obedience may not be the most moral course of action. In the end, of course, Maria leaves the monastic life, marries the captain, flees the Nazis with the family, and moves to Vermont to set up a very nice vacation resort that is still going strong. You may be wondering why I'm starting with a question from a 1965 movie that harkens from what may well be the golden age of cinematic musicals, when I'm supposed to be giving a talk related to Byzantine studies. The reason is that one may ask a similar question. How do you solve a problem like 2 9th century Byzantine monks who had iconoclastic verses etched into their foreheads by an iconoclastic emperor? I will spare you a song and dance because the words do not fit nearly as well into verse and because I don't have a choir of Byzantine monks to back me up. And I also really don't want to throw my back out in the tap routine that would happen in the bridge of the song. I admit that I am joking here, but the question is still legitimate because in the case of Theodorus and Theophanes Graptoi, it is indeed strange, as my title suggests. In the case of these brothers, the question to do with them is scholarly, not practical. It would certainly be anachronistic to send the Graptoi into the clutches of the Nazis. And whereas Maria gains notoriety and happiness by leaving the religious life, Theodore and Theophanes remain in the historical record because of their utter and complete commitment to it. The monks became very important iconodule saints, and both, but particularly Theophanes, ended up holding a great deal of religious authority. The question is, of course, how did they gain so much authority when they were in essence defigured by an emperor, a condition that usually resulted in humiliation and shunning in the pre-modern world? This is indeed a strange case. Perhaps the place to start the investigation is with the lives of Theodore and Theophanes Graptoi. Most of what we know of the brothers comes from the late 9th century text, The Life of Michael Syngelos, which is the earliest extant reference to them. The story of the Graptoi takes center stage in the Vita and occupies a lot of the concern of the hagiographer, or person writing the saint's life, who seems to use them and their deeds as a way to bolster Michael's spiritual dossier to prove that he's a saint. From what we can gather from the Vita, Theodore was born in 775 and Theophanes in 778 in what has been known as the land of the Moabites, which is probably a reference to the east side of the Dead Sea, so we're in Israel. In 800, the two brothers arrived at the Lara or monastery of St. Sabas in the desert near Jerusalem, where they became disciples of Michael, who was already living there. Soon they became widely known for their learning and religiosity. And shortly thereafter, Michael was named Syngelos, or cell shared. It indicates a close association or assistant to the Patriarch of Jerusalem, one of the great religious figures of the time. In this capacity, Michael was sent to Rome in either 812 or 813 to inquire into the controversy over the filioque, which has to do with the creed. And Theodore and Theophanes and a third monk named Job were sent with him. Yet they never made it to Rome because they were stopped in Constantinople when Emperor Leo V reestablished iconoclasm in 815 and changed everything. So, as a slight digression, what an important one. It is important to realize that the entire story of the Graptoi must be understood in the context of Byzantine controversy over iconoclasm. Iconoclasm, as it is used here, literally means image breaking. Although there are descriptions of ancient Greek and Roman sources that talk about the silencing of memory and the destruction of images of public officials, our modern understanding of iconoclasm really is rooted in Byzantine religious and theological debates. The questions, of course, are where did iconoclasm in the Byzantine world come from, and why is it so important to the people of the empire? Those are some icons. Simply said, icons had power in Eastern Christendom, but mostly following the late 7th century. So they began to be seen as powerful transmissions of holy presence. The power of icons is rooted in the development of the cult of saints, which began in the earliest days of the Christian church. Early on, people went to saints to ask them to intercede on their behalf with God and Christ. When a saint died, their burial or other cult site, relics, and objects the holy person touched became imbued with saintly presence. The quote, real presence, end quote, of the saints still existed. And miracles, holy cure, and salvation would happen at these sacred loci. The same is true of images or icons of saints because saintly presence was believed to be in them as well. So people could ask God's help through the veneration, but not worship of icons. The fine line between veneration and worship of icons made theologians and members of the general populace uncomfortable. People in Byzantium actually cared about theological faith, like there's riots of normal people in a way that doesn't happen in our modern world. If we believe the scholarly tradition and somewhat problematic sources, everything came to a head for the first time when Leo III became emperor in 717. He is credited with starting iconoclasm, even though the sources are vague. And we can talk more about the vague sources if you want to in the Q&A. It is more clear that his son Constantine V was more fervently iconoclastic, as demonstrated by the Synod of 754, under him, which declared that Christ, the Virgin, and the saints could not be represented in images, and that icons can no longer be displayed or devotion paid to them. The first phase of the controversy ended in 787 by Emperor Constantine VI and his mother, the Emperor Irene, although she did use the mill. All things seemed well and good until Leo V reinstated iconoclasm in 815. The second phase under Leo, Michael II, and Theophilos seemed to be more public, characterized by more destruction of art, including the whitewashing of the icon of Christ over the Chapel Gate, which was the main entrance to the imperial palace, and more violent persecutions of iconodules. Iconodules are the ones who like icons, who support them. This is where our protagonists fit into the historical record. Finally, in 843, under Michael III and Theodora, the Synod of Constantinople ended iconoclasm and established the triumph of Orthodoxy. The conflict was over, but the effects on Byzantine religion, society, and collective memory would be long-lasting, and collective memory may be the most important. But why was there this movement towards iconoclasm in the first place? Well, we're not 100% sure. The sources are conflicted and vague. One thought is that Leo III had suffered several defeats at the hands of the Arabs as Islam expanded, and coupled with a few massive natural disasters, felt that God was punishing the empire for their sins, particularly in relation to icon veneration. Another possibility is that Byzantine thinkers, theologians, and the emperor had come under the influence of Muslim ideas about more strict monotheism, which caused concern over icon veneration being worshiping false idols. Finally, iconoclasm was tied up in attempts to suppress the powerful monasteries in growing towns of the empire, which were proving to be a thorn in the side of the emperor. Regardless of the causes, this is truly a conflicted, divided, and violent time in Byzantine history. Or is it? The question stems from the fact that the iconoclastic controversy, the sources written about it, and any persecution that happened during the two periods of iconoclasm can be problematized and hence present issues for the modern historian. First, the vast majority of the sources about the debate that are extant come from later iconodule writers. The victors really did write the history in this case. They purged the record of iconoclastic accounts, and we only have one side. As a result, many scholars, including Leslie Brubaker and John Holden, questioned the severity of the conflict and the extent and violence of the persecutions. For our purposes here, though, it may not matter, because we are getting an account of what the iconodules wanted us to believe, and still reflects at minimum their beliefs about Theodorus and Theophanes, and at maximum, how many in Byzantine society would have accounted for disfigurement in the acquisition of spiritual power. So, that is the setting when our traveling monks were brought before Leo V and his Senate in the Golden Triclinium, which was a cross between a throne room, an audience hall, and a dining room in the imperial palace. When they refused to become iconoclasts, the emperor had them confined and imprisoned and began a cycle of interrogation, torture, and exile for Theodore and Theophanes. When Theophilios became emperor in 829, the situation became worse for the brothers as they were recalled from exile. The first audience with the new emperor signaled that things were going to go poorly for our monkish heroes as they were brutally tortured. The pain for the monks was not over and got worse. In their second audience with Theophilios, once again, the brothers were beaten. The life of Michael relates that, quote, the emperor commanded the saints be stripped of their clothing and made to stand naked before him. When the holy martyrs of Christ had been stripped, the emperor ordered very strong men to bind their hands with fine thongs and to stretch 6 thongs tightly over each of them, so it would not be possible for them to sway back and forth as they were beaten. When the saints had been firmly stretched out, he commanded them to stand in front and another behind them, and commanded them to strike the saints mercilessly with axe-height whips. They struck them with so many blows that it was necessary to alternate 4 soldiers for each of them. When they had lacerated the saints to the extent that they were powerless to offer a reply, and their blood, like the stream of a river, had stained the whole floor, he commanded that they be dragged and thus taken back to prison. Quote. These moments are grotesque. Although drawing on images of early martyrs and even Christ, as Constantino has stated, however, the last of these was provocative, the one I quoted. Quote, this is a very disturbing and extremely spectacular scene that provokes horror, outrage, nausea, and disgust. End quote. I ask you to hold on to the words spectacular, outrage, and most importantly, disgust. This is an emotion-laden account meant to inspire the faithful through contrasting feelings of repulsion, attraction, admiration, and pity. It serves this purpose well. Finally, on the 18th of July of 836, when they refused to accept communion once again, 12 iambic verses that supported iconoclasm were inscribed in the foreheads of Theodorus and Theophanes. They became the Graptoi, literally those written upon. End quote. They were banished and thrown into prison, where Theodore died in 841, likely in part because of the wounds he received. With the triumph of orthodoxy in 843, Theodore was acclaimed a martyr, and Theophanes was appointed metropolitan of the important See of Nicaea. It's kind of like an archbishop, a position he served in until he died in 845. So, to many, this story is problematic, but that might well be the purpose of it. It might be worth explaining the genre of hagiography for a moment in order to put this text in its literary and historical context. This is the text. The life of Michael Synkelos is what is known as a vita, or life. The plural is vitae. For which scholars, the term vitae has come to mean the same thing in the parlance of medievalists of the day. These vitae, along with other texts about saints and their cults, comprise the genre of hagiography, literally sacred letters. I think I got the Greek right. Case in point. Check me if I didn't. This is one of the most popular types of literature in the Middle Ages, both in Western Europe and Byzantium. Stories of the saints were read in churches, monasteries, and other venues where people gathered. Although popular at the time, the vitae are often problematic for a modern audience. They contain miracles, which 21st century science cast doubt upon, and many look the same, with tropes commonly found across the cults of different saints. At one point, scholars dismissed hagiography as being useless in determining the past. Many of us have thankfully moved beyond that positivist approach and begun to see more value in them. It is true that it's hard to construct a genuine and detailed account of the past events from them, but that was not their author's intent. Rather, hagiographers aimed to construct a spiritual dossier of their subject to guarantee their sainthood, while at the same time creating models of religious behavior, albeit an unobtainable model for the faithful. This is very true in the case of the text we are examining today. For example, in direct reference to this particular vita, Constantino notes that, quote, Byzantine iconophile hagiographers, as is the case with the majority of medieval hagiographers, were more interested in providing their audience with fantastic novel narratives than reporting historical events. In some ways, this isn't entirely fair to the hagiographers because it turns them into mere shock jocks of the medieval world, leaving their work with little worth to the modern historian or literary critic. Imagine Howard Stern being considered in 1,000 years. The vita may not be reliable for depicting actual events, but the question may be stated, what are they reliable for? The answer to this question goes to the very heart of what we as historians study. I constantly remind my students that history is not what happened in the past. Rather, it is an interpretation of what the people told us happened in the past. They tell us through written documents, through works of art, both profane and sacred, through material culture, and through the archaeological remains. There is no way for me to know exactly what happened in the emperor's palace. I just don't know. I wasn't there. I can, however, interpret what this particular hagiographer wants me to think happened there. This gives me the freedom to construct a sense of mentalities and standards for behavior, as mentioned above. It also allows us to proceed with this study because we can begin to understand how the author and the people in his thought world perceive disfigurement and its possible relationship to power. Yet, this is a strange case even as vita go. So, this may seem like a simple story that I have completely overcomplicated and we can all go home. You might be asking, why do I keep saying this is a strange case? Weren't people tortured for their religious beliefs all the time in the Middle Ages and Byzantium? It was a violent time after all, right? The answer is not like this. Even in the highly dramatic vitae and other accounts of conjugal martyrs, the treatment of Theodorus and Theophanes stands out as unique because no one else was disfigured in this way. In fact, there are no sources that indicate anyone else in Byzantium, saint, martyr, or political figure, was either. In her book on facial disfigurement in the early Middle Ages, Patricia Skinner provides an appendix with all the examples she found of facial disfigurement before 1300. In the table, we clearly find the brothers, and they are the only examples of this kind of branding. All of the other Byzantine examples are nose cutting, eye gouging, removing of ears, and the shaving of head and face. In addition, the act of disfiguring the saints occurred across social stratification. It is rare in the sources for a person to punish someone of lower status in this manner. So the brothers are odd, in part because their disfigurement was unique. The second reason they are a strange case is the Graptoi do not show up either in the primary or secondary sources very often. If they are treated so lightly, which is part of the oddity of their case, why should I take the time and effort to focus on them and present my ideas here? Well, for one, they do show up at all. Skinner has argued that people with facial disfigurements are left out or intentionally stay out of the pre-modern historical record. So I might be trying to have it both ways by saying that they are both absent and present in the record, but that contradiction itself points to the last and most important reason this is a strange case. The brothers received an enormous amount of authority, even though they were disfigured. The fact is that Theodorus and Theophanes obtained a high level of religious authority in a society and culture that praised the physical perfection of the male body as a prerequisite for authority. They are of such concern to Michael's hagiographer shows their importance, especially if we accept the argument that iconodules exaggerated the acts of such defenders of icons. The writer did, after all, choose these two guys to write about, and there was later veneration of them. Finally, they received influential positions in the restored Orthodox Church. Yet, neither of these men were perfect in body. There seems to be an appreciation, almost fascination, with bodily perfection in Byzantium. Haito Hazati cites examples from both Anakomina and Selos, two Byzantine historians, the time contemporaries, that indicate beauty was found in the ideal male body. Further, the perfect face was made up of perfect parts. Although these examples post-date the Graptoi, it is hard to believe that a perfect face could have had an imperfect forehead, even in the 9th century. It was also hard to believe that the perfect face could be missing parts. Nose cutting, ear cutting, and blinding were seen as taking away from male beauty. The same would be true of facial disfigurement. It seems then that male beauty and the perfection of the male body was a prerequisite for authority, at least in the political realm, although it would be hard to distinguish the political and the religious in the person of the emperor. So, as we carefully look at the text depicting the life of Theodorus and Theophanes, the circumstances of iconoclasm, and the expectations for male beauty in Byzantine society, a simple explanation that one brother was martyred and the other ordained seems a little empty and does not go far enough in accounting for their great religious authority. I also think that simply saying that the brothers had religious authority and that perfection was only required for political or imperial authority is problematic, because the evidence does not support that conclusion either. I suggest we dig a little deeper. I'm often nervous when scholars rely too heavily on theory to explain historical phenomena, especially when the theories are not based on the material that they're developed for. But I'm going to try to apply theory here to answer our central question of how the brothers gained so much authority without perfect bodies. To this end, I propose we travel down the avenue of disability theory. Disability studies is not a new theoretical orientation. Irving Goffman wrote a book entitled Stigma in 1963, which David Turner cites along with Foucault's Birth of the Prison, wrong because I said Foucault, as the parents of what has become known as critical disability studies. Yet, interest in examining the role that disability played in the past and plays in the present has increased in the last 20 years or so. Catherine Kudlik announced in 2003 that, quote, not since Joan Wallace Scott heralded a new age with her gender as a useful category of historical analysis, have students faced such an exciting time to rethink what we do, end quote. By invoking Scott, Kudlik asserted that disability is a useful category of analysis. The approach works here in part because we are able to look at disability as a social category rather than an individual characteristic. When the impairment is viewed not in terms of how the individual who had the impairment experienced it, but in terms of how society viewed the individual as well as the condition itself, disability considered the center of historical inquiry. So the first model, so there's four main models. First and oldest is the medical model, treats disability as a problem that needs to be solved or an illness that needs to be cured. The model has become very reductionist in making people with disabilities the objects of study while discounting those who do not wish for a cure. So in our study of the Middle Ages in Byzantium, because many disabilities could not be cured, and accordingly, medieval disability studies could not actually exist. Second is a social model of disability. It treats disability as a social construct and focuses on the distinction between impairments, physical differences, and disability, which are social barriers that ensue. The model, in many ways, has been the most guiding in medieval studies, leading Irina Metzler to argue that there were not disabled people in the Middle Ages at all, but only those with impairment. The model has been questioned for its effectiveness and critiqued for its misleading binary distinctions. Able, disabled, nothing in between. In addition, the focus on the social leaves the body itself outside of historical analysis, which is problematic because the body has been proven to be important across both time and place in many societies, almost all. As a result, a third model, cultural model, has developed to balance constructivist understandings with the physical embodiment. What does that mean? Well, it means that we can look both at body and culture between lived experience, the lived corporal difference, and social perceptions. In other words, the model holds that the body can be analyzed both as a corporal experience and as a diversive construction. Finally, in direct responses for a call for a model that fits the medieval world better, Edward Whitley has proposed a religious model. I believe Edward Gibbon, it was a superstitious religious time, so it makes sense. Here, disability is put into a Christian context in which people at the time saw disability and impairment as resulting from the individual's sin and could be cured by divine or saintly intervention. Here, Whitley influenced heavily by Foucauldian methodologies, considers religious discourse as one worldly mechanism in the discipline, regulation, and punishment of bodies, especially those that deviate from social norms. Don't worry, that's the last reference. Some of us have claimed that this is merely the medical model recast in pre-modern light, and the same critiques hold. Regardless, the religious model doesn't work for us today because the disfigurement was clearly not a result of sin, but a result of staying true to Orthodox faith. All of these models have been critiqued fully, especially in the fact that they are reductionist and marginalized. Further, they all to some degree fall short in describing the pre-modern world. To that point, the majority of models I have presented are based on phenomena as they occur in the modern world. The medieval and Byzantine evidence doesn't always support them. Following Joshua Eiler, Julie Singer has argued that, quote, the recent history of medieval disability studies shows us that, for the most part, contemporary models of disability yield categories and identities that do not appear to correspond to medieval social realities. As the above discussion indicates, one response to this analytical predicament has been to develop new models of medieval disability. No doubt, we should always follow the evidence. Here again is a lesson I teach my students all the time. We need to make the theory fit the evidence, not the evidence fit the theory, even if the result is at worst confusion and at best a new model. It is clear that modern disability theory needs to be challenged in the case of the Graptoi. I suggest we look at what was going on the ground in 9th century Byzantine society to see which parts of theory fit and which do not. In other words, we need to figure out exactly what we know. So we're this far in and now we're going to figure out what we know. We know first that a huge issue exists in our analysis because the Graptoi do not fit the tropes in Byzantine hagiography. The tropes indicate that the disabled look for cures from saints. Yet here the brothers are disabled in the Vita. And there are few cases in which saints themselves are impaired in the sources. Further, the brothers are not looking for a cure, and their disability is certainly not linked to spiritual illness, but rather is connected to their devotion. We also know that the Graptoi, after they were disfigured, they were different from what other people in Byzantium would have seen as the normal, much less ideal human. One of the key features of disability is that it signifies a deviation from the norms of society. We live in a world of norms. Teenage Rod will tell you that. Which we are in constant relationship of comparing ourselves and others to. They might concern height, weight, intelligence, sexual habits, and certainly ability. Disability is defined and redefined in a relationship with the norms of ability. The problem occurs when we assume that the norms are timeless and have always existed, when in reality they are socially constructed in the context of a particular time and place. This allows for marginalization of those with disability and often stigmatized with deviance. The argument has been made that disability as a category is not possible in the pre-modern world because as a concept it relied on scientific standardization and statistical analysis that were not found until the 19th century. This may be so, but there were certainly what Hobgood and Wood have referred to as, quote, non-standard bodies, end quote, which reshaped people's conception of the body. Disability in the end is a social construction, and it is defined as a set of social relationships between those with standard bodies and those without. And the primary sources do indicate that these relationships existed in Byzantium, even if they were not the same as modern ones. One of our potential relationships to be navigated is those with facial disfigurements. Within the wide scope of disability lies disfigurement, which has in the past been referred to as deformity, but that we don't use that term for the most part. What sets disfigurement apart is that it is understood large part in aesthetic terms as opposed to ability. David Turner remarks that, quote, deformity is understood as the opposite of beauty, or more generally, a deviation from normal appearance. While the stigma of deformity derives from the appearance of bodies, modern definitions of disability focus more on the function of bodies and their relationship to their social and physical environment. That is certainly true in the case of the Graptoi. There is no mention of their inability to go about their lives, at least physically, as they had before the break, at least until Theodore died. It was their wounds that set the brothers apart. Patricia Skinner has argued that, quote, facial disfigurement challenges basic encoded human responses, which blur symmetry and wholeness, and accounts of violence done to the face signal that something extreme is going on. Whilst the medieval technologies to repair the damage in diseased face have become ever more sophisticated, social attitudes towards people with acquired disfigurements have remained largely static. One thing that sticks out in her list of facial disfigurements from the Middle Ages is that, quote, disfigured injuries and blindings were designed to disable, to humiliate, to cause pain and suffering, and above all, to demonstrate the power of the person injuring, quote, but not to kill the disfigured. People seem to be disfigured as punishment and to eliminate them from being able to take power, and yet they disappear after that. People had nose cutting in Byzantium, so they couldn't be punished. Or blinding, split noses, all kinds of horrible things. Through her intensive study of the source material, Skinner has concluded that, quote, people with disfigurements have been left out of historical narratives because their faces literally do not fit. They might even work hard to remain out of sight. But those with facial disfigurements were not out of sight of others with whom they came into contact. As a result, another aspect of disability theory that seems to apply to the pre-modern evidence is that of visibility. Rosemary Garland Thomas remarked that the history of disabled people in Western society is, quote, in part the history of being on display, as being visibly conspicuous while being politically and socially erased. Being seen is an essential part of how society relates to the disfigured individual and to everyone else. And it constructs its meaning of that disfigurement. Part of the construction is the reaction to those who are seen. Describing his own experience, Dennis Cregan, who had muscular dystrophy, wrote in 1966 that, quote, Probably from a social point of view, a simple facial disfigurement is the worst disability of all. The quickly suppressed flicker of revulsion is, I am quite sure, quite shattering. The face is an essential part of identity, and its alteration often leads the observer to experience disgust. I admit I am scared of numbers. But in a quantitative study, researchers at Royal Free Hospital School of Medicine in London showed medical students pictures of various severities of facial disfigurement engage their emotional responses. The results are probably not surprising because most of us would likely expect that the more severe the disfigurement correlated with higher levels of avoidance reactions. Why should we not assume that Byzantines would have been taken aback by facial disfigurement? Remember the disgust that Constantino posited regarding the scene of the brothers' torture? Yet the scene is more complicated because disgust can lead to attraction. Here is where I think the theory helps us to explain the authority of the Graptoi. With visibility, Singer's transhuman model of disability might fit here. As a means of both destigmatizing disability and understanding its role in pre-modern society, Singer determined that in the materials, especially literary traces of disability in medieval Europe, the conditions seem to almost add something to the individuals in question. In other words, in medieval texts, the disability adds a layer of identity instead of stripping others away. At first, this seems to work in our case. The disfigurement adds and enhances authority. Yet Constantino argues the brothers were actually stripped of something. The account is completely gendered. And it is no accident that the hagiographer decided to write about men being tortured in the name of iconoclasm. Further, he claims that it is not coincidence that the younger two monks are victims of the emperor and the elderly Michael is not. It is clear that the image being presented is that Theodorus and Theophanes are being stripped not just of their clothes, but of their youth, of their masculinity, of their bodily perfection, and in a way of their eroticism in an almost performative pornographic spectacle. This hardly seems to be the case of adding something to the saints to explain their authority. It is true the case does not point to the post-para or subhuman, but it's hard to see the brothers as transhuman. We return to the requirement of physical and bodily perfection to hold our power. Are we really any closer to an answer? The problem is that the theories are not holding in full, only in part. And we may need to complete the picture with a different lens or a combination of several. So, as good historians, remember you get to be one with me for this talk. We have followed our method well. Based on background information, we have acknowledged the problem that the case of the Graptoi is strange. Next, we designed a research question. Why did they get authority despite their disfigurement? Then we interrogated the assumption that the body was important to Byzantines, including as a requirement for power, and thus martyrdom and ordination do not answer our question. These assumptions seem to hold. I hope you believe it. We then thought about our first theoretical model, the lens of Byzantine studies, which I thought might be the key to understanding the brothers' situation. Now I'm beginning to wonder if that really is the solution to our dilemma. Okay, time for us to invoke the muses and to enter Cleo's laboratory and experiment with the past. Or as I like to put it, throw stuff against the wall. Don't worry, I know what's going to say. The first experiment we are going to run is to see if another theory that is related to disability can supplement it to fill in the rest of the picture. I'm going to propose that we look at monsters and try to apply monster theory to our case. But why am I able to bring monster theory to bear on a paper dealing with disability? Golden and Mittman argued that, quote, most significantly for a study of pre-modern Europe, we must necessarily look at the monstrous because that is where the disabled are found. Yet perhaps the reverse works as well, and we need to look at the disabled because that is often where the monsters are found. The well-known image of the, quote, monster crippled, end quote, allows us to see disability and monster theory can converge. Figure in question sits at the bottom of folio 327R of a manuscript of our theory and romances in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Don't worry, it doesn't have anything to do with art. It's one of these random illuminations. It dates to the later part of the 13th century, so both in location and chronology, the illumination is out of our context. That said, it is an example of intertwining two social constructs together in a way that both early medieval and early Byzantine writers were more than happy to do. The figure is a hunchback anthropomorphic humanoid. You can see the ridge of hair in its mane, which along with the shape of its hand would be marking as not human. He is clearly a monster, and he is clearly disabled as seen in the crutches he needs to support himself, given his truncated leg and bandaged thumb. Yet, we cannot say, look, the monster is disabled, so people thought the disabled were monsters. That's far too simple and not borne out by the evidence. That said, Good and Mittman wrote that, quote, it is vital to keep at our forefront of our minds that neither disability nor monstrosity has any ontological status. That is, they are not states of being, though cultures often treat them as such. Rather, they are both encounters in which beings, human and otherwise, have meaning imposed upon them from without. Further, Golden, in another article with Sy, writes the quote that disability, like monstrosity, enacts a set of social relations through which we can observe, describe, and challenge the social processes that produce an attempt to marginalize difference. As many scholars have observed, disability and monstrosity share a similar function in literature. They exhibit a plot engendering difference that needs to be confronted and eradicated. In addition, Emily Kack and Patricia Skinner explored the relationship between disfigured faces and perceptions of monstrosity in the medieval period in a recent article. Based on the work of these scholars, I propose we test whether it is at the intersection of disability and the monstrous that we have a better understanding of the case of the Graptoi. This all works for two reasons. First, here are more monsters. First, the monsters denote otherness, and that the Graptoi certainly being something other than their counterparts with standard bodies. The monster is a cultural body created by society, which is ever-changing and serves important ends. We create the monster. One of those purposes is to allow the other to exist as a way in which we define itself. Going deeper, however, Cohen has argued that the monster, quote, looks at us, end quote. Similar to the male gaze, the monstrous gaze regulates society by ensuring norms are maintained and the individual doesn't slip up. Monsters patrol the margins of society and in a sense, the borders of the possible. Theodorus and Theophanes helped police the borders of what was possible religiously, bodily, and in terms of authority. Noel Carroll has argued that, quote, the monsters are not only physically threatening, but they are cognitively threatening. They are threats to common knowledge, end quote. This is truly destabilizing as both the monster and the disfigured creates a sense of cultural and societal vertigo. Furthermore, Cohen's third of his famous 7 theses concerning monster culture dictates that, quote, the monster is a harbinger of category crisis. The order of things is disrupted, whether it is the order of self versus other, holy versus sinful, or able versus disabled. Iconodule writers and hagiographers, in a sense, coupled the brothers' disfigurement and the resulting monstrosity in order to destabilize Byzantine religious society and police its margins in order to prevent iconoclasm in the future. Because in the end, monsters define inclusion and exclusion. Truly, the rhetoric of monstrosity allows for the definition of the self and what is human, and for the marginalization of certain others, much as disfigurement and impairment. The second reason this works is that like disfigurement, monsters create fear and repulsion. Monsters create fear because they represent the worst of humans. They are the foils for our mental, physical, and moral health. They do what we cannot in a civilized society. Yet Cohen argues that the monster also attracts, quote, the same creatures who terrify and interdict can invoke potent escapist fantasies. The linking of monstrosity with the forbidden makes the monster all the more appealing as a temporary egress from constraint. One only needs to look at the popularity of modern horror movies, the ratings for television shows about serial killers, and the love of Halloween to know this is true. The disfigurement of the Graptoi created repulsion and attraction. All these arguments stem from the fact that monsters are, in fact, real. They need to be. Just as impairment, disability, and disfigurement had to be real in 9th century Byzantium. We need them for ourselves to exist. These beings, real in fact or real in conception, help us to negotiate social relations, social norms, and everyday lives in ways which would not be possible without them. Drawing on Cohen's 7 theses, we can see the monster as demarcating the realm of the ordinary and the sacred. In this case, the disfigured and the monstrous. We can see the saints in their monstrous form policing the borders of possibilities of holiness. We can see them in the symbolic interchange, the push and pull of repulsion and the attraction of the monstrous body and its promise of salvation and religious perfection. And yet, what if it goes beyond the monstrous, or short of it, depending on how you look at it? What if the disfigurement creates not a monster, but merely, or even significantly, an animal? That is not to say the animal is more or less or even equal to the monster, just that I'm going to separate them for the moment as categories of analysis. The animal, however, like the monster, is like the monster in that they offer bodies through which the dreamt identities for the no vocabulary yet exists for. Animals thus allow for the human imagining of the self and that which is other than the self, but also allow humans to discern meaning from the non-human landscape. They offer, quote, possible bodies, end quote, that are dynamic and disruptive for humans, both now and in the Middle Ages. And what Gail Weiss has called, quote, embodiment as intercorporeality, end quote, new forms of human meanings and stories emerge by interacting with animals, even if still strange. So animals occupy the place of other, signifying through observation and artistic representation a nurturing nature. Part of the process is that animals, fish, and birds affirm the principle that through interacting with the animals on actual, imagined, and symbolic levels, humans are connected to nature and are reminded that they come from the natural world and will return to it. Even when domesticated, the relationship between animals and humans points to the definition of nature and self. Larson and Fuller, among others, trace the process of domestication of animals, which began in the Neolithic period, and have concluded that animal domestication greatly affected not just the relationship between human and animal, but the actual evolution of humans in general. Byzantium certainly featured livestock and other domesticated animals. As in other predominantly agrarian societies, the relationship between humans and animals in Byzantium were complex and rarely straightforward and not necessarily logical. In Byzantium, the difference between the domestic and the wild animal would be ownership, and the symbol through which possession was determined, in which in many societies takes the form of branding. Much of the discussion points to a fundamental difference between animals and beasts, yet no matter what is shared and what is different, humans are in essence animals. I think we can clearly agree that humans are different from other animals, and that society and culture dictate certain behaviors that need to be respected in terms of the interaction between species. Following that, Joyce Stainsbury has written that, quote, the taboos that were established to protect the boundaries between human and animals remained in place enough to cause at least discomfort with creatures that existed on the imagined borders between species. Salisbury is referring in this passage predominantly to hybrid creatures like the cynocephali or dog-headed men. But what if the branding of these individual humans, the Graptoi, caused them to be more like animals than the typical human, making them almost hybrids in and of themselves? To that end, what if in the case of these two saints, the etchings on their forehead can be seen as a brand, which caused them to be possessed animals, which were not quite human and not quite animal? Maybe the same issues that are raised by monster theories can imply the repulsion and attraction are still in place. It may still help to explain the authority granted to these disfigured saints. But this hinges on tattooing and branding of animal and human. The history of deliberately marking the body and the practice of tattooing is long and stretches across time, place, and society, even if its function varies. Much scholarly work has been done on the practice and meaning of tattooing, and some have gone beyond the mere art and methods of self-expression contained within altering the body. According to Patel Ghosh, tattooing and body marking have had many purposes. expressing identity, bodily adornment, to demonstrate status and power in society, as therapy, and to connect the supernatural. Tattooing, in turn, can be seen as a form of safe social behavior, which manipulates the body, which, as we have seen here, is a medium of communication about power in social relations. There is a darker side to the tattoo, as it can indicate a loss of liberty or a mark of punishment. Mark Gustafson, among others, has written on the issue of tattooing in late antiquity as punishment. That might fit here, since the emperor was punishing the two monks for their support of icons, but it doesn't really answer our question, because it doesn't it explains why they were tattooed, but not why they had religious authority. Gustafson even notes that in this case, the intended punishment doled out by the emperor was indeed reversed. It is not too far of a reach to go from self-inflicted tattooing to branding caused by an external agent. The practice of branding in many ways indicates ownership. Research has been done on the phenomenon of marks placed on the bodies of sex trafficking victims. It indicates the desire to demonstrate the ownership of a person, the perpetrator, victim, and community alike is far more common than many of us would like to think of, but it's far too little. Still, most people think of branding, they think of animals. Branding has traditionally been seen as indicating ownership, and there is a large corpus of scholarly literature on animals to property. But what if the verses on the foreheads of Theodorus and Theophanes were etched to make them at least partially animals to establish ownership? But who, in the end, owned these saints? I think it's threefold. At first, they were owned by the emperor to be used as a deterrent to others who wanted to challenge his own authority in regard to iconoclasm. Later, the ownership of the saints passed to later iconodules who wanted to use the story of the brothers to advance their own agenda in versions of sanctity and expression for holy behavior. Finally, and most important, the branding indicated and conferred the ownership of Theodorus and Theophanes to God. They were domesticated by the Almighty to serve as his agents on earth. And the verses were the reminder the brothers were God's own. We are fundamentally animals, and Joyce Stansbury has noted that, quote, in our definition of what it means to be human, it seems we cannot deny for long the beast within us. Quote. Maybe then the beast within these saints is as a different variety of creature than the rest of us, set aside by disfigurement and monstrosity, which makes them unique animals owned by God. He can use them as he sees fit. Maybe then spiritual authority was granted to Theodorus and Theophanes as the specially selected and marked possessions of God, because of, and not despite, their disfigurement, because of what it symbolized and how it was attractive to those. Okay, trigger warning. The next slide is a little graphic. In 2010, Time magazine put the image of a woman named Ashab Bibi on its cover. She had been the victim of nose cutting by the Taliban after she ran away from her abusive husband. The caption read, "What happens if we leave Afghanistan?" Patricia Skinner began her 2014 article on nose cutting with that picture. In the article, Skinner tried to provide insight into the modern event by drawing on knowledge of practice in the Middle Ages. Here, she took a feminist approach to disfigurement. Bibi eventually got a new prosthetic nose, much as the Byzantine Emperor Nikolas received a golden one, which allowed him to return to the imperial throne. But the article nonetheless asks an important question that I'm sure many of us seek to answer. What can the past really tell us about the present? In addition, Skinner's article shows that disability theory can go hand in hand with other lenses, such as queer theory, critical race theory, and feminist theory, to help us further our understanding of the past and the current world we live in. Furthermore, Singer and Coffey have asserted that disability studies may be a means to encourage social activism, a statement which may well have merit. I'm not going to go on a crusade for social justice today. The cover of Time may well be seen as an opportunity for that kind of information. But what of this paper? The question may be, what is the significance of this study, and why is it worth for you to sit here so long listening go on about two fairly obscure saints? So what? First, it allows us to return again to Cleo's laboratory. Many of the theories I have mentioned, especially those surrounding critical disability studies, have rarely been applied to Byzantine material before. Theories were developed as a lens to examine early modern and modern society, culture, and religion. Granted, there are a number of current studies of medieval disability, but those predominantly explore Western Europe. As a result, the theories and approaches need to be tested against that which is Byzantine and adjusted to match the evidence. The experiment allows us to remember that theory ought to proceed from the evidence, and historians should avoid at all costs making the evidence appear to the public. Second, as a result of the experiment in Cleo's laboratory, I am problematizing disability studies in order to advance it beyond modern notions that dominate the field. When the ubiquity of modern theory is broken, both past and present images of both standard and non-standard bodies, as well as their relationship to each, can be reassessed and reimagined. Finally, the study moves beyond a model of marginalization of disability. These two saints can turn the issue on their head. They are not pushed to the outskirts of society, but rather play an essential role within it because of it, and not in spite of it. In the end, in conclusion, I agree with Skinner that looking at the evidence of disfigurement in the past can help us understand practice that still exists. I also feel comfortable concluding that Theodorus and Theophanes did gain their religious authority because of, and not despite, their disfigurement, a process which we can understand better if we carefully and judiciously apply the lenses of many critical things. The ramification of this conclusion is that we can learn a lot from the odd cases in history, the strange cases, by looking at them from different angles and to see how literary representations in their many forms, from historic hagiographic texts to magazine articles, the human body itself can invert social and religious norms. So, how do you solve a problem like two 9th century Byzantine monks that had iconoclastic passages etched into their forehead by an iconoclastic emperor, end quote? I suggest we start by reframing the question and not assuming they were a problem, but a vehicle for further understanding. Thank you for playing in Cleo's lab with me and going on this journey today. I'm more than willing to take questions if anyone, unless it was that clear. Yes.
So what about the idea in Christendom that disfigurement is something of an honor, right? Like St. Francis receives the stigmata, and this is something he's venerated for.
Right.
These men are arguably tortured and disfigured, and then they are, I guess the one who didn't die,
Yeah.
is put into a position of power later on, right? Yeah. After the iconodules
Yeah.
are successful in challenging this idea of iconoclasm. It kind of reminds me a bit of the way modern politicians use I'm thinking of like Dan Crenshaw from Texas or Tammy Duckworth. Both represent different sides of a political opinion, but both are kind of perceived as something, their bodily disfigurements give them a certain credibility, right? So wouldn't have this played similarly given the context of who we're talking about and the nature of the debate?
Great question. And one that I thought about a lot when I first conceived of this project, because it would be very easy to say, oh, they were tortured and became martyrs and it's the same as always happens, right? So I think, so there's a lot wrapped up in your question, and I'm going to talk about first St. Francis. He received the stigmata in the 13th century, so much later. Like, he is the first stigmata, or stigmatic. So it's a little hard to put him into this category. And that's also a little different because that is said to come directly from God, as opposed to inflicted upon him by another human. The example of modern politicians, I see your point, but I think the problem with that is that the authority is coming not just from the disability, but from the military service. So they're tapping into a patriotism that goes along with the military service. So I think that's the problem when we look at modern examples and trying
Sure,
to use them.
but that doesn't
So-
correlate to some kind of religious
I mean, you can
conflict, right?
I mean, you could argue that. The reason why I think these two guys are so different is they are so, I mean, they're even different from Francis, because Francis is in Western Europe. And there isn't this sense of the perfection of the body in Western Europe that there is in Byzantium. There is an absolute obsession with the male body in Byzantium. To the, like I said, to the point that if you had something physically wrong with you, you could not be emperor. Like, you were out. Nikolas is the one example because he created a golden prosthetic. So I hear, and there is something about it that is associated with martyrdom, but I just couldn't get over that perfection of the body when I was in conception. And that's the part that, like the sandpaper in our brains that rubbed me the wrong way and made me look for another explanation. That may well be an explanation.
So a follow-up, and I don't
Yeah.
want to take up, is that why they are not in any of these images disfigured or?
No.
Yes.
I mean, I'm glad you
That-
asked. I was thinking
Because there is a theology that I mean, it goes back to the early church, like, there was a real concern when bodies were like chopped up that they couldn't go to heaven because they weren't fully, so the theology develops that once you die, all your parts come back and you're raised up to heaven in perfection. So these images are icons after they're dead, supposed to communicate with God, so they are restored to form. Does that make sense?
it's interesting because you were talking about Western Europe.
Yeah.
But you often do see images of the saints holding their heads
Yeah.
or their cut off body parts. And Byzantium.
Yep. Yeah, Peter.
I had sort of a similar question to Dr. Kmade. Just that, how do you think this would have applied to leprosy? Because that was obviously, it's referred to a lot in Christian stories, and Jesus himself healed lepers. So
Yeah, leprosy is a complicated concept in the Middle Ages. Lepers fluctuated sometimes from being the ultimate of Christian charity to other times being blamed for the Black Death. So people have done an incredible amount of work on leprosy. Again, leprosy isn't the same kind of inflicted disfigurement, but I mean, I can definitely point you to book. I mean, there's endless books on leprosy. Some very new stuff that's really kind of fascinating. But the thing about disability studies right now is it's encompassing so much. Like it's pretty cool. And leprosy is one. Yes.
Oh, this is not that much, but, so you said that like the male body at this time was like the perfection that often they were attacked. And
Yeah.
so did that only apply to men or were women attacked because of their perfection of their body as well? But like jealousy.
Women are just
Yeah.
like that's part of it. A lot of this theology of the male body, or a lot of the perfection of the male body relies on the theology of Christ, right? That the male body is supposed to be Christ. Women, I mean, they, like I said, there is some degree, but it's mostly men. We don't, and the problem is the source survives. We just don't have as many examples of female disfigurement in Byzantium. There's some examples in the Western Europe. Like, there's some great examples. Sorry, this is a tangent that I didn't talk about Western Europe. There's examples of holy women in the West who cut off their ears or cut off their noses to prevent them from being miracles, so they can become virgins and handmaidens of God. So we know so much more about Western women than we do about Byzantine women. But that isn't a dumb question. It's great.
Yeah, so when you talked about disfigurement being used as a political or religious punishment, it seemed almost standardized. You know, you lose a nose or an ear to prevent you from becoming emperor or
Yeah.
holding authority. So when it comes to the uniqueness of the branding were they harkening back to anything else? Do you know if they're a precursor to this kind of punishment in ancient Greek world? Or did the emperor just think this up one day?
I actually don't know much about that. That is actually something that, as I finish this up, I need to look back to antecedents.
So I'm just curious about like what other collective meaning might be behind that, you know, you got branded like these other people do.
I mean, slaves is the best.
Yeah,
example.
that makes sense.
I mean, and that draws the modern sex trafficking.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, branding is a very rare thing. Like, that's one of the things that makes these guys so strange. And what attracted me to the first, they really are. That's you don't have any Zoom questions. Yeah, no, okay, but- Yes,
A less philosophical question.
okay.
How long were these 12 verses that they were able to fit on the forehead?
You know what the best part about that question is? In some ways, it doesn't matter. We have no idea, but it doesn't matter because we're just told about, like, that's kind of what I was getting at about not being there and not seeing it, is that we don't know. I mean, it would have hurt. Can you imagine? And we aren't talking like a branding item. We're talking about something you take it. I don't want to go into like nastiness of it, but so I guess it's kind of like numbers in the ancient medieval world. I always tell my students that numbers are not actual numbers in the medieval and ancient world. They're either a little or a lot or somewhere in between. So what they're trying to say by saying 12 verses were etched in their foreheads is that a lot were. And they're also drawing parallels to these verses and how stupid these verses are because they go on forever. And why can't you just have one or two Greek words that say, love God or something? Like, they're trying to demonize the iconoclasts even more by putting a lot of stuff on. Does that make sense? Yeah, a lot or little, numbers are strange.
First of all, if anybody's watching on Zoom, you can put stuff in the Q&A if you want, and we'll see it. So feel free, but I have kind of like a surface level question and then a more specific version of it. So how well known was their story and how soon? Like how widespread and common knowledge? And then the follow-up, the more specific one with that is you're making the argument about possession and at first, that means that the emperor possessed them and then the iconodules. But the knowledge of them would have been important to the authority that goes along with that possession. So,
Great question. Like the life of Michael was written sometime in the last quarter of the 9th century. And
so like 50
they
years or
died,
so later.
yeah, less than. So it would have been, I mean, in the hearsay would have been around our 11th.
But how many people would have known then during the time of the emperor that performed the disfigurement that he had done that? I mean, how much is that, you know, either bolstering him or not?
That's one of those things we just don't know the answer to. My guess is if he was trying to, if he was trying to up his street cred with the iconoclasts, he would have wanted everyone to know. The problem is that because the iconodules wrote about it, it's possible this never happened. In which case, the first ownership, my thesis. The first part of my thesis would qualify. Second two wouldn't necessarily, but no, but I'm just assuming that he would have gone and had someone scream it from the hills because he would have wanted people to keep her.
I have a more general question, and this is just because I didn't get to talk to people stuff.
You got a captive audience.
Yeah, so earlier you mentioned how the iconoclasm produced all of this internal strife, like I think you even kind of suggested on street level.
Yeah.
Right? I'm a little bit curious about that because it seems to me like, number one, this would have been a very esoteric debate, right, among theologians. And number two, I would think that if there is any class dynamics in play, that a mostly illiterate population would have kind of liked having icons at their disposal because images tend to teach people
Yeah.
in ways that especially if they weren't literate. So how did this become such a dynamic debate?
Well, one answer is it was divided by class to some degree. Lower classes certainly would have been more likely to be accountable. So it becomes a class issue. Why you put more by but so one, it does become that class issue. But this is one of those weird things about Byzantine society is that people would be sitting in the functional equivalent of coffee houses or wine shops talking about theology. Like they would talk about theology like we talk about politics. How we used to, but we can still talk about politics. But it mattered to these people in a way that I've never quite wrapped my head around. Like there it was over this, there was literally rioting in the street. Like, where's the image of the Chalkgate Gate? Of course, now I've lost it. I can find it. Maybe. I mean, they're whitewashing it, but they've got shields and they've got swords. Like, I mean, that's the Christ image, but the image of Christ here is the same as the image of Christ in the icon. So it's literally salvation. And as I tell my students, you cannot underestimate how much hell mattered to these people. Like, they were scared to death of going to hell. And it dominated their lives. So if something like whether or not an icon can help you get closer to God, or whether talking to an icon would get you further away from God, it mattered to them in a way that we don't even see in Western Europe. But you got to remember, these people are regularly going to church, so they're hearing these theological. Now they might be getting wrong to some degree. Like, how many of us have gone to a political rally and got what they said wrong? But it's sort of that it mattered to these people in a way that is almost unfathomable to the modern audience. Does that make? I mean, it doesn't make sense because it
just
became
seems so civilized, right? Like you're, as opposed to, I'd like to care about that, but I gotta bang the rent out this month. You know what I mean? So to get that riled up about what seems
so
doctrinal matters.
to show that it's not civilized, there is a set of riots under Justinian between what were known as circus factions. So they had horse races, right? There were like 4 teams of horse races. They all wore different colors, and you would wear it's like soccer hooligans, right? And at one point, and they would fight with each other. Well, Justinian angered them so much that they got together and rose up again. Major riot, burns Constantinople, right? Part of it was over theology, a different theological thing. As a result of that, if we believe the sources, over 10,000 people were massacred. Doesn't seem a whole lot of civilization over theology.
Well, but in a way, that's like the exact point.
Yeah.
Like to get that riled up over an idea that,
Yeah. I think that's what happens when you're that worried about hell.
I guess so.
What are we doing? Quarter after? So maybe one. So before we wrap it up, I want to, as all good scholars do, I want to make some acknowledgements. Thank you, Dr. Stark, for inviting me. Dr. Shalhoub, who is in absentia, and who's teaching, but for organizing this. Thank you so much, Becky, for all the organization. Thank you to Nikki, who was also here. But also want to thank my home department and library for their support to my scholarship. One of my colleagues, Dr. Ashley Elbrod, has done a lot of work on disability and helped me. And lastly, I want to thank Dr. Rachel Birmingham for letting me bounce ideas off her proofreading and putting up sessions. So thank you very much. All right, thank you very much.
Oh, I'm sorry. What?
Yeah, it's probably